Prejudice in the skies takes a turbulent turn. We've all felt judged by a stranger's glance, but what happens when that judgment comes at 30,000 feet? A senior flight attendant, blinded by arrogance, decides a young black teenager doesn't belong in first class. She mocks her, belittles her, and tries to humiliate her in front of everyone. But she makes one critical error. She has no idea who she's talking to. In the next few minutes, the power dynamic won't just shift, it will shatter. This isn't just a story about karma, it's a story about what happens when you push the wrong person too far. The Aerolux First Class Lounge at JFK Terminal 4 was a hushed sanctuary of muted colors and quiet efficiency. Here, the clinking of ice in a crystal tumbler was the loudest sound, a gentle percussion against the backdrop of murmured conversations about market caps and weekend trips to the Hamptons. It was a world designed to insulate, to soothe the frayed nerves of the global elite before they were sealed into a pressurized tube and hurled across the Atlantic. Into this serene bubble walked Zara Washington. At 17, she was a study in contrast to her surroundings. She wasn't draped in Gucci or carrying a Birkin bag. Instead, she wore a simple dark grey hoodie from her high school's robotics club, a pair of worn-in jeans, and well-loved Nike sneakers. Her hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, and the only accessory she wore was a pair of high-tech Bose headphones around her neck. She carried a single scuffed backpack that looked heavy with textbooks and a laptop. To the casual observer, she looked like a student who had perhaps wandered into the wrong area, a lost lamb in a den of silver-haired lions. She presented her ticket at the front desk. The agent, a polished man in his late 20s, scanned it without a second glance. "Welcome, Miss Washington. Your flight to Zurich ALX 112 is on time. Boarding for first class will begin in approximately 45 minutes from Gate A7. Please make yourself comfortable." Zara gave a small, polite smile. "Thank you." She found an empty leather armchair in a corner, slid her heavy backpack onto the floor, and pulled out a worn paperback on quantum computing. She was on her way to an international STEM competition in Switzerland, the culmination of a year's hard work. She was nervous, excited, and completely focused on the complex equations in her book. She was so absorbed, in fact, that she didn't notice the pair of eyes that had been tracking her since she sat down. The eyes belonged to Eleanor Vance. Eleanor was a senior flight attendant with Aerolux, a 20-year veteran of the skies. She carried herself with an air of rigid authority that came from decades of managing unruly passengers and enforcing federal aviation regulations. With her blonde hair pulled into a severe, immaculate chignon and her uniform pressed to a razor's edge, she was the very picture of control. But beneath that polished veneer, a bitter resentment had taken root over the years. She served the world's wealthiest people, smiling as she poured their champagne and fluffed their pillows, all while drowning in credit card debt and a mortgage she could barely afford. She saw Zara and her mind, a well-oiled machine of snap judgments, immediately categorized her. Charity case? It sneered. Or maybe one of those influencer kids whose 15 minutes are already ticking down. The airline probably gave her a publicity seat. Eleanor took a sip of her lukewarm coffee, and a wave of indignation washed over her. First class was supposed to be exclusive. It was a privilege, one that this girl in her cheap hoodie clearly didn't understand or deserve. It diluted the brand. It cheapened the experience for the real first-class passengers. Eleanor watched as Zara, completely oblivious, got up to get a bottle of water from the complimentary fridge. She walked with a quiet confidence that irritated Eleanor even more. It wasn't the boisterous look-at-me entitlement of the newly rich, but something deeper, calmer. It was the confidence of someone who simply believed she belonged wherever she was. And Eleanor Vance had decided right then and there that Zara Washington didn't belong here. She made a mental note, seat 2A. She would be working the first-class cabin on ALX 112. This, she thought, with a thin, predatory smile, could be interesting. The storm was gathering, and its unsuspecting eye was a 17-year-old girl reading a book about quantum physics. The boarding call for ALX 112 echoed through the lounge. Zara packed her book, shouldered her backpack, and made her way to the gate. She joined the short priority queue, standing behind a man in a tailored Brioni suit, who was loudly closing a deal on his phone. When she reached the gate agent, she handed over her passport and boarding pass. As the agent scanned it, a sharp, feminine voice cut through the air. Just a moment. Eleanor Vance had positioned herself near the gate, ostensibly to greet the premium passengers. She glided over, her smile as bright and artificial as the cabin lighting. She addressed the gate agent, but her eyes were locked on Zara. There might be a problem with this seat assignment, Eleanor said, her voice laced with a saccharine sweetness that failed to mask its condescending tone. We've had some computer glitches today. I wouldn't want this young lady to get settled in the wrong cabin. The gate agent looked confused. The system shows everything is in order. Ms. Washington, seat 2A. Eleanor held her gaze on Zara. Honey, are you sure this is your ticket? Were you traveling with a parent, perhaps? Sometimes they get separated in the system. Zara met her eyes a flicker of surprise, giving way to a calm, steady focus. No, I'm traveling alone. The ticket is correct. Her voice was even betraying no agitation. Eleanor's smile tightened. Of course. Well, welcome aboard. She gestured grandly toward the jet bridge, a queen granting entry to her court. Zara walked down the jet bridge the encounter, leaving a sour taste in her mouth. She'd dealt with prejudice before the subtle and the overt. She recognized the look in Eleanor's eyes. It was the look of someone who had already written a story about her, and was now determined to make her play the part. She found her seat, 2A, a luxurious pod with its own lie-flat bed, large entertainment screen, and a small minibar. It was more space than she needed, but her father always insisted. If you're flying over an ocean, you get a bed, he'd always say. Your brain is your most important asset. It needs to be rested. She stowed her backpack and was just about to sit down when Eleanor appeared at her side, a bottle of champagne and a flute in hand. Can I get you a pre-departure beverage orange juice, perhaps? The emphasis on orange juice was slight but unmistakable. The subtext was clear. Champagne is for adults. Champagne is for people who belong here. Just water, please, Zara replied, ignoring the bait. As other passengers filed in, businessmen, a Swiss couple, an older gentleman who nodded at her politely, Eleanor's attention remained fixated on Zara. Another flight attendant, a kind-faced young man named David Hayes, offered Zara a warm towel and an amenities kit. He treated her with the same professional courtesy he showed everyone else. Eleanor watched him, her lips pursed in disapproval. Once the plane was airborne and the seatbelt sign was switched off, the service began. David was taking meal orders when Eleanor intercepted him. I'll handle this section, David. Why don't you see Mr. Sterling in 4D? She approached Zara, her tablet in hand. Now, she began, her tone that of a teacher addressing a slow student. Our menu tonight is a 5-course affair. It can be a little overwhelming. The chef's selection is the pan-seared halibut with a saffron risotto. Or if that's too adventurous, we do have a simple chicken breast. Zara looked at the menu. I'll have the filet mignon medium rare with the truffle mac and cheese, please. Eleanor's perfectly plucked eyebrows rose a fraction of an inch. She typed it into her tablet with a series of sharp, deliberate taps. An excellent choice, The charade continued throughout the meal service. Her water glass would remain empty just a minute longer than anyone else's. When Zara asked for a blanket, Eleanor brought one that was still in its plastic wrap and practically tossed it at her, saying, "Here you go. Try not to make a mess." The other passengers were beginning to notice. Mr. Sterling, the distinguished gentleman in 4D, a titan of industry named Arthur Sterling, was watching the interactions with a deep frown. He'd seen this kind of petty power play before. David, the other flight attendant, looked increasingly uncomfortable, trying to compensate by being extra attentive to Zara when Eleanor's back was turned. Zara, for her part, remained a picture of composure. She ate her meal, watched a documentary on her screen, and worked on some equations in a notebook. But inside, a cold anger was beginning to build. This wasn't just poor service. It was a deliberate campaign of humiliation. Eleanor wasn't just having a bad day. She was enjoying this. She was trying to provoke a reaction, to create a scene that would justify her prejudice. She wanted the angry black girl trope to play out so she could be vindicated in her assessment. Zara promised herself she would not give her that satisfaction. Her father had taught her two things about power. First, never to flaunt it, and second, never to let anyone abuse theirs at your expense. Eleanor Vance, cruising at 37,000 feet, was about to learn a lesson about the second rule. The point of no return was fast approaching. The breaking point came 2 hours into the flight, somewhere over the vast, dark expanse of the Atlantic. Zara had finished her work and was trying to recline her seat into its lie-flat position. It seemed to be stuck. After a few gentle tries, she pressed the call button. David was there in seconds. "Is everything all right, Ms. Washington?" "Hi, David. My seat seems to be stuck. I can't get it to recline," she explained quietly. "Let me take a look," he said, kneeling down. Sometimes the mechanism can be a bit finicky. Just as he was examining the controls, Eleanor materialized. "What seems to be the problem here?" she asked, her voice sharp. "Just a small issue with the seat, Eleanor. I think I can fix it," David said, trying to de-escalate a situation that hadn't even started. Eleanor shot him a withering glare before turning her full venomous attention to Zara. "You probably broke it," she said, her voice low, but carrying in the quiet cabin. "These pods are very sensitive. You have to know how to operate them. They aren't toys." The accusation was so absurd, so blatantly hostile, that it stunned the nearby passengers into silence. Arthur Sterling lowered his newspaper. The Swiss couple exchanged a shocked glance. Zara finally let her mask of placid composure slip, not to anger, but to a chilling calm. "I pressed the button marked Recline. I'm fairly certain that's the correct procedure. Are you suggesting I'm incapable of operating a button?" "I'm suggesting," Eleanor hissed, leaning closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was somehow more insulting than a shout, "that you're in a place you don't belong, and your presence here is a disruption. I've been checking the passenger manifest. I've cross-referenced everything. There is simply no way a teenager on their own legitimately purchased a $16,000 ticket. It's a fraudulent booking or a computer error, and I am going to correct it." This was it. The ultimate escalation. It was no longer about bad service. It was a direct accusation of fraud. David stood up, his face pale. "Eleanor, that's completely out of line. You can't accuse a passenger of that." "Stay out of this, David," she snapped. "I'm the senior attendant here. I'm in charge." She turned back to Zara, her face a mask of smug triumph. "Now I'm going to give you two options. You can quietly gather your things, and I will find you a seat in economy. We'll pretend this was all a simple misunderstanding. Or I can have the captain radio ahead, and you can be met by security upon landing in Zurich to explain how you obtained this ticket. Your choice." The cabin was dead silent. Every eye was on Zara. They saw a young girl alone, being cornered by a woman in a position of authority. They expected tears or shouting or a terrified compliance. They got none of it. Zara held Eleanor's gaze for a long moment. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out her smartphone. Eleanor scoffed. "Oh, who are you calling your mummy? It's a little late for that, don't you think?" Zara ignored her. She swiped through her contacts and pressed a name. As she did, she activated the plane's Wi-Fi calling feature, a premium service her father's company had ironically helped develop. The call connected almost instantly. "Hi, Dad," she said, her voice perfectly level. "Sorry to bother you. I'm having a bit of a problem on my flight." She listened for a moment, her expression unreadable. "Yes. Aerolux 112 to Zurich. There's a flight attendant. Her name is Eleanor Vance, who is accusing me of ticket fraud and is threatening to have me arrested." She paused again, nodding slightly. "Okay. No, I'm fine. She's right here." She held the phone out toward Eleanor. "My father would like to speak with you." Eleanor Vance looked at the phone as if it were a venomous snake. A flicker of uncertainty crossed her face, but her arrogance quickly reasserted itself. Who could her father possibly be? Some mid-level manager who would shout a bit and then back down. She snatched the phone from Zara's hand. "This is Eleanor Vance, senior flight purser," she said, her voice dripping with officious self-importance. "To whom am I speaking?" She listened. The smug expression on her face began to waver. It slowly melted, replaced by confusion, then disbelief, and then finally by the dawning gut-wrenching horror of pure, unadulterated terror. Her face went white, then a sickly shade of grey. The hand holding the phone began to tremble. "Yes, sir," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I understand, sir." "No, sir. Of course. Right away, sir." She handed the phone back to Zara, her hand shaking so badly she could barely hold it steady. She stared at Zara, not as a misplaced teenager, but as if she were looking at an avenging angel. She had just crossed a line she never even knew existed, and she was about to fall into the abyss. The man on the other end of the phone was Marcus Washington. To the world, Marcus Washington was a titan. He was the founder and CEO of Nexus Dynamics, a tech conglomerate that had its hands in everything from satellite communications to AI development and private aerospace ventures. He was a regular on the covers of Forbes and wired a self-made billionaire who had built an empire from a garage in Palo Alto. His name was synonymous with innovation disruption and immense world-altering power. He was a man who could get the President of the United States on the phone in under a minute. An airline CEO was a small fry. When Zara called, he had been in a late-night board meeting in New York, finalizing the details of a multi-billion-dollar acquisition. His phone, which was usually silenced and handled by an assistant, was on the table in front of him, set to a special mode where only one number could get through his daughters. When it rang, he paused the meeting mid-sentence, held up a hand to his board of directors, and answered immediately. "Zara, is everything okay?" He listened, his expression hardening from paternal concern to icy fury as she recounted Eleanor's accusations. He heard the forced calm in his daughter's voice and knew she was handling it with the grace he'd taught her, but the thought of anyone, anywhere, threatening and humiliating his child made his blood run cold. When Eleanor Vance took the phone, her arrogant, self-important tone was like gasoline on a fire. "This is Eleanor Vance, senior flight purser. To whom am I speaking?" Marcus's voice was quiet, almost gentle, but it carried the chilling weight of absolute authority. Ms. Vance, this is Marcus Washington. I believe you are on a plane that is currently using Nexus satellite hardware for its Wi-Fi, which my company owns. You are also on a plane whose engine turbines contain patented alloy components, which my company also owns. And you are at this moment threatening my daughter. Silence. He let the words hang in the air, allowing the full implication to sink in. You have made a grave error in judgment, Miss Vance. He continued, his voice dropping even lower, colder. You are not fit to serve the public, let alone wear a uniform that represents customer service. Your career with Aerolux is over. That is not a threat. It is a statement of fact that will be executed in the next 5 minutes. Now give the phone back to my daughter. While Eleanor was stammering her apologies, Marcus was already texting his chief of staff. The instructions were simple and brutal. Call Robert Haley, CEO of Aerolux. Now, tell him flight ALX 112 has a problem. My daughter is being harassed by a flight attendant named Eleanor Vance. By the plane. His chief of staff, a man accustomed to strange and powerful requests, didn't question the last 3 words. He just acted. On board ALX 112 chaos was beginning to ripple outward from seat 2A. Eleanor stood frozen, her mind struggling to process the name Marcus Washington. She knew it. Everyone knew it. It was like hearing God introduce himself over the phone. Zara took her phone back. Dad, yes, I'm okay. Okay, I will. Love you too. She hung up and looked at Eleanor, who was now staring at her with wide, terrified eyes. You should probably go back to the galley now, Zara said, her voice devoid of triumph or malice. It was a simple factual statement. Before Eleanor could move, the chime for the in-flight phone rang in the galley. A moment later, a flustered David Hayes approached the cockpit door and knocked. It opened, and the co-pilot leaned out. After a brief, hushed exchange, the co-pilot disappeared back inside. A minute later, the cockpit door opened again. This time, it was Captain Miller himself. He was a tall, authoritative man with silvering hair and a calm demeanor that had been cultivated over 30 years of flying. But right now, his face was a mask of bewilderment and immense stress. He walked directly into the first-class cabin, his eyes scanning the passengers until they landed on Zara. He walked over, ignoring the still paralyzed Eleanor completely. Ms. Washington. He asked, his voice full of a respect that had been absent moments before. I'm Captain Miller. I've just received an unprecedented call from our corporate headquarters. I need to confirm that I am speaking to the daughter of Marcus Washington of Nexus Dynamics. Zara simply nodded. I am. The captain took a deep breath, the full earth-shattering reality of the situation crashing down on him, his crew, and his flight. I see. Well, Ms. Washington, on behalf of Aerolux, I need to offer you my most sincere and profound apologies for the treatment you have received from a member of my crew. He shot a look at Eleanor that could have melted steel. This is an unforgivable lapse in professionalism. He then looked around at the bewildered first-class passengers. Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention, please? There has been a change in our flight status. He paused as if struggling to find the right words for a scenario that had never existed before. As of 2 minutes ago, he announced, his voice echoing in the stunned silence. This aircraft, Aerolux Flight 112, is no longer a commercial flight. It has been chartered, privately. For the remainder of the journey to Zurich, this plane is operating as a private jet for Ms. Zara Washington. The captain's announcement hung in the air, thick and unbelievable. A commercial transatlantic flight, mid-air, suddenly turned into a private charter. It was impossible. It was absurd. It was something out of a movie. Arthur Sterling, the business magnate in 4D, let out a low whistle. He'd negotiated hostile takeovers, bought and sold companies worth billions, but he had never in his entire life heard of someone buying a plane out from under its passengers while it was in the air. The sheer audacity, the raw, unapologetic display of power was breathtaking. He looked at Zara not just with respect, but with a kind of awe. She wasn't just some rich kid. She was the heiress to an empire, and he had just witnessed the empire strike back. The Swiss couple looked utterly baffled, whispering to each other in German. The other passengers just stared their minds, trying to compute what they had just heard. Eleanor Vance finally seemed to unfreeze, but only to crumble. The blood drained from her face, leaving a pasty, terrified mask. She understood. Marcus Washington hadn't just complained to the CEO. He hadn't just threatened a lawsuit. He had performed a corporate power move so extreme it bordered on the surreal. To protect his daughter from a flight attendant, he had effectively bought the entire flight. He had made the aircraft Zara's private domain. Captain Miller wasn't finished. He turned his gaze directly to Zara. "Ms. Washington," he said, his voice now deferential. "As the sole charterer of this flight, you are now our client. The aircraft and its crew are at your disposal. Our flight plan remains the same for Zurich, unless you instruct otherwise. However, all in-flight decisions are now yours to make. Specifically," he paused, letting the weight of his next words fall squarely on Eleanor, "regarding the crew." This was the moment. All the power in the cabin had coalesced around seat 2A. Every passenger, the captain and the terrified flight attendants, all looked at the 17-year-old girl in the high school hoodie. Zara looked up at the captain, then her eyes moved to David Hayes, who looked mortified and sympathetic. Finally, her gaze settled on Eleanor Vance. For the first time, Zara saw past the arrogant bully. She saw a woman who was utterly broken, whose life had just been dismantled in a matter of minutes because of her own ugliness. There was no pleasure in it. There was no victory lap. There was only a grim sense of justice and a profound sadness that it had come to this. She spoke, her voice quiet, but carrying the authority that had been thrust upon her. "Captain," she began, "thank you. My only instruction is that we continue to Zurich as planned. All the other passengers are your guests, and they should continue to receive the highest level of service." She then looked at David. "David, you've been professional and kind. I would like you to be the purser for the remainder of this flight. You're in charge of the cabin." David's eyes widened. A field promotion mid-flight on the orders of the new owner. He could only nod, speechless. "Yes, Ms. Washington. Thank you." Finally, Zara turned her attention to the ghost-white Eleanor. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't gloat. She delivered the final verdict with the dispassionate precision of a surgeon. "Eleanor," she said, using her first name for the first time, "your behavior was not just unprofessional. It was cruel. You judged me based on my age and the color of my skin. You tried to humiliate me. You abused your authority." She took a breath. "You are relieved of your duties. Effective immediately. You will go to the crew rest area, and you will remain there until we land. You will not speak to me or any other passenger again." She paused, letting the sentence hang in the air before delivering the final blow. "My father has already spoken to your CEO. When we land in Zurich, you will be met by an Aerolux corporate representative. You should pack your bags. You are fired." The words, spoken so calmly, were more devastating than any scream could have been. It was an execution, delivered without emotion. Eleanor Vance made a small, choking sound. Her carefully constructed world, her 2 decades of seniority, her very identity, it had all been incinerated. She stumbled backward, bumping into a bulkhead, her face a grotesque canvas of shock and despair. 2 other flight attendants who had been watching from the galley quickly and gently escorted her away, not out of sympathy, but to remove the embarrassing spectacle from the cabin. As she disappeared behind the curtain, a strange quiet settled over the first-class cabin. It was the quiet of a storm that had passed, leaving behind a completely new landscape. Zara Washington looked out her window at the endless dark sky, the owner of the jet feeling not a sense of triumph, but the heavy weight of a power she never wanted to use. The rest of the flight to Zurich was surreal. Under David Hayes's new leadership, the cabin atmosphere transformed. The service became impeccable, but it was more than that. There was a palpable sense of relief and quiet respect among the remaining crew. They moved with a renewed purpose, treating every passenger, especially Zara, with a level of attentiveness that bordered on reverence. Arthur Sterling leaned across the aisle. "Young lady," he said, his voice low and full of admiration. "I've been in boardrooms where fortunes were won and lost with less grace than you just displayed. Your father is a powerful man, but you, Ms. Washington, you have character. Don't ever lose that." "Thank you, sir," Zara replied quietly, appreciating the sentiment. She spent the next few hours trying to read, but the words swam before her eyes. She couldn't shake the image of Eleanor's face, the arrogance curdling into terror. She hadn't wanted to ruin a woman's life. But what was the alternative? To endure the humiliation, to let prejudice win her father's lesson echoed in her mind. Never let anyone abuse their power at your expense. It was a hard lesson with hard consequences. When ALX 112 began its final descent into Zurich, the mood was calm. For the passengers, it was the end of a memorable, almost mythical flight. For Zara, it was the end of an ordeal. For Eleanor Vance, it was the end of everything. As promised, when the jet bridge connected to the aircraft, a stern-looking man in a dark suit, accompanied by airport security, was the first to board. He was the head of European operations for Aerolux, flown in from Frankfurt, on an emergency charter of his own. He spoke quietly with Captain Miller, then was directed to the crew rest area. Eleanor emerged a few minutes later, stripped of her authority. She was no longer in her crisp uniform, but in civilian clothes. Her face was blotchy, her eyes red-rimmed and empty. She wasn't carrying her luggage. A ground crew member would fetch it for her later. She was a non-person. As she was escorted down the jet bridge, past the waiting passengers, she didn't look at anyone. Her 20-year career ended, not with a retirement party and a gold watch, but with a silent, shameful walk past the very people she was supposed to serve. The karma, however, was just getting started. It followed her off the plane and into the harsh reality of the world she had created for herself. The story of the mid-air private charter was too spectacular to stay quiet. By the time Zara had cleared customs, it was already a whisper on aviation blogs. By the time she was eating breakfast in her hotel, it was a headline on global news sites. The story was framed as a stunning display of wealth, but also as a powerful anti-racism statement. Aerolux, in a desperate attempt at damage control, issued a public apology to the Washington family and announced a company-wide review of its diversity and inclusion training. Eleanor Vance became the face of that corporate failure. Her name was leaked. Her photo culled from social media was splashed across the internet. She was an instant pariah, a real-life airline Karen whose story was a viral sensation. She was fired, of course, but the consequences cascaded. The airline industry is a small world. She was blacklisted. No other major carrier would touch her. Drowning in debt, she had to sell her house to cover her legal fees from a failed wrongful termination lawsuit. The stress took a toll on her marriage, which soon fell apart. Within a year, Eleanor Vance, the proud, powerful senior flight purser, was working at a discount retail store stocking shelves to make ends meet. Every day, she dealt with customers, forcing a smile that never reached her dead eyes. Sometimes, she would see a young black woman walk in confident and self-assured, and she would have to turn away the memory of her own spectacular downfall, a fresh, open wound. It was a quiet, anonymous, and devastating form of justice. She had built her life on a pedestal of perceived superiority, and in one flight with one teenager, she had been knocked off it, landing in the ruins of her own making. Meanwhile, David Hayes's life took a dramatically different trajectory. His promotion was made permanent. He was lauded within the company as an example of perfect professionalism. 6 months later, he was tapped to lead the training program for all new first-class cabin crews, his story used as a case study in how to act with grace and integrity. His career soared. The karma of ALX 112 wasn't just a single lightning bolt that struck Eleanor. It was a force that redistributed fortune, rewarding the good and punishing the wicked with an almost biblical sense of balance. Zara Washington won the robotics competition in Zurich. Her team's design for an autonomous search and rescue drone was hailed as revolutionary. She accepted the award on a brightly lit stage, speaking eloquently about collaboration, innovation, and the future of technology. She was poised, brilliant, and completely in her element. No one in the audience would have guessed that just days earlier, she had been at the center of a dramatic international incident. On her flight home, on a real private jet this time, one of her father's, she sat in a plush leather seat, staring out at the clouds below. The incident with Eleanor Vance had changed her. It had been her first real visceral lesson in the sheer world-bending power her family wielded. It was a power that could be terrifying if misused, a power she was now acutely aware she would one day inherit. Her father met her at the private airfield. He hugged her tightly, a rare display of public affection. "I'm proud of you, Zara," he said. "Not for the competition. Well, yes, for that too. But I'm proud of how you handled yourself on that plane. You were calm, you were decisive, and you were just. I got a woman fired, Dad." She said the words heavy. "I ruined her life." Marcus looked at her, his expression serious. "No," he said firmly. "She ruined her own life. She made a series of choices fueled by bitterness and prejudice. You simply handed her the bill. There's a difference, Zara. Power isn't about avoiding conflict. It's about having the strength to see it through to the right conclusion when it becomes unavoidable." He put his arm around her as they walked toward the waiting car. "What you did sent a message, not just to that woman or that airline, but to everyone who heard that story. The message is that dignity isn't negotiable. It doesn't matter if you're in a hoodie or a three-piece suit. It doesn't matter if you're 17 or 70. It doesn't matter what color your skin is. You have a right to be treated with respect. And when someone tries to take that away from you, you don't back down." Zara looked up at her father, understanding dawning in her eyes. It wasn't about the money. It wasn't about buying a plane. It was about drawing a line. The flight attendant had mocked a black teen for flying alone. By the next minute, that teen was in charge of the jet. It sounded like a fantasy, a power trip. But it wasn't. It was the necessary and dramatic rebalancing of scales that had been tipped by hatred. As she settled into the car, she knew this was a story she would carry with her forever. It was a stark reminder of the ugliness of prejudice, but also a powerful testament to the fact that sometimes, in the most unexpected ways, karma doesn't just knock on the door. It charters the whole plane and takes you on a one-way trip to justice. The world moves on, but the internet never forgets. Back in her life as a high school senior in New York, Zara Washington discovered that the anonymity she had always cherished was gone. The story of ALX 112 had morphed from a news headline into a piece of modern folklore. At school, she was no longer just Zara, the quiet robotics captain. She was Jet Girl. The nickname wasn't always meant to be malicious. Sometimes it was spoken with awe, other times with a tinge of envious sarcasm. But either way, it was a label that separated her from her peers, a constant reminder of the incident that had thrust her into the global spotlight. She tried to ignore it, focusing on her studies and her team's next project, but the incident's ripples kept reaching her. Her email inbox was flooded not just with messages from friends, but with requests from reporters, television producers, and even social justice organizations who wanted her to become a spokesperson. They wanted to hold her up as a symbol of the fight against racial prejudice and classism. Zara found it all deeply unsettling. "I'm not a symbol," she complained to her father one evening in his study. "I'm a 17-year-old who wants to build better guidance systems for aerial drones. I didn't ask for this. All I did was call you." Marcus Washington leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers. "Sometimes, Zara, you don't choose the platform you're given. The world chose this story because it was dramatic and clear-cut. Good versus evil David versus Goliath, except Goliath had a credit card with an unlimited balance. But what they're responding to is the injustice of it all. The question is, now that you have their attention, what do you want to do with it?" Zara didn't have an answer. She felt a growing pressure to be more than she was, to have a profound message for the world, when all she had was a profound desire to be left alone. Meanwhile, for Eleanor Vance, the ripples were a tidal wave that had obliterated her entire world. After being fired and publicly shamed, she found herself in a state of freefall. Her so-called friends, many of them fellow airline employees, distanced themselves, afraid of being associated with her toxicity. Her savings dwindled with alarming speed. The comfortable middle-class life she had worked 2 decades to build was gone. She finally found a job at a big-box store in a neighboring state, a place where she hoped no one would recognize her. Her new uniform was an ill-fitting polyester polo shirt. Her authority was limited to telling customers which aisle the paper towels were in. The bitterness she'd felt in the first-class cabin of an Airbus A380 was nothing compared to the corrosive resentment that now consumed her. In her mind, the narrative of what happened had twisted into a grotesque parody of the truth. She was the victim. She had been a loyal employee, a diligent professional who was destroyed by a spoiled, arrogant teenager and her megalomaniac father. She was a casualty of cancel culture, a working-class woman crushed by the whims of the untouchable elite. This story, which she repeated to herself in the lonely silence of her small apartment, was the only thing that kept her from shattering completely. One afternoon during her lunch break, scrolling through hate-filled comments on an old news article about the incident, she saw a link to an interview with a man named Donnie Peters, a controversial online journalist known for giving a platform to silenced voices. An idea, ugly and desperate, began to form in her mind. If the world had made her a villain, maybe it was time to start acting like one. She found Donnie Peters' contact information. She was going to tell her side of the story. Across the ocean, at Aerolux headquarters in London, the ripple effect was taking a more constructive form. The incident had been a catastrophic blow to their brand, and CEO Robert Haley was determined to turn it into a teachable moment. A new mandatory training program was rolled out for all cabin crews. Internally, it was called the Washington Protocol. It was a comprehensive course on de-escalation, implicit bias, and cultural sensitivity. And the man chosen to help lead the training was David Hayes. Promoted to a management position, David now traveled between Aerolux hubs, sharing his first-hand account of Flight 112. He never spoke ill of Eleanor. Instead, he used the situation as a powerful example of how a single prejudiced assumption could lead to a corporate disaster. He spoke of Zara with immense respect, highlighting her composure and dignity under pressure. David Hayes, the flight attendant, who had simply done his job with kindness and professionalism, had become the new face of the company's service philosophy. His act of basic decency had altered the course of his life as profoundly as Eleanor's act of malice had altered hers. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, Zara was in the school library when her phone buzzed with a news alert. It was from one of Donnie Peters' media outlets. The headline read, "Exclusive airline Karen. Eleanor Vance breaks her silence. I was sacrificed to appease a billionaire bully." Zara's blood ran cold. She clicked the link and saw a promotional photo of a defiant-looking Eleanor poised to give a tell-all interview. The article promised shocking revelations about the arrogant behavior of Zara Washington and the threatening call from her father. At that moment, an unread email on Zara's laptop seemed to glow with new significance. It was an invitation to be a keynote speaker at the upcoming Future Leaders Symposium in Washington, D.C. She had been planning to ignore it. But seeing Eleanor's face, seeing the lies being prepared for public consumption, Zara realized her father was right. She had a platform whether she wanted it or not. Remaining silent was no longer an option. If Eleanor was going to own a narrative of lies, then Zara would have to step up and own the truth. She clicked on the email and began to type her reply. Eleanor Vance's interview with Donnie Peters was exactly what one would expect a masterclass in deflection and victimhood. Broadcast across multiple platforms, it showed a carefully rehearsed Eleanor, dabbing at her eyes, recounting a version of events where she was a diligent flight attendant, merely trying to maintain order. The girl? Ms. Washington. Eleanor began her voice, trembling with synthetic emotion. She had an air about her, a defiance. She refused to listen to instructions about her seat. She was dismissive. I was concerned for the safety and comfort of the other passengers. She painted Zara as a disruptive force and herself as a professional, simply doing her duty. The phone call from Marcus Washington was framed as a terrifying threat from a powerful man who barked at me like I was nothing. They destroyed my life, my career, all because a privileged child didn't like being told what to do, she concluded, staring earnestly into the camera. Is this the world we live in now, where the rich and powerful can just snuff out the lives of ordinary people? The interview caused a firestorm. Online opinion was sharply divided. A vocal minority rallied behind Eleanor, seeing her as a symbol of the working class being crushed by the 1%. They spammed social media with hashtags like "There's justice for Eleanor." But a larger, more discerning majority saw through the performance. They pointed out the inconsistencies in her story and the sheer improbability that a world-renowned airline would allow a flight attendant to be fired on the whim of a single passenger without just cause. The debate raged for a week, and all eyes turned to the one person who hadn't spoken publicly, Zara Washington. Her moment came at the Future Leaders Symposium. The auditorium was packed with bright high school and college students, educators, and members of the media. When Zara was introduced, a hush fell over the room. She walked to the podium, not in a hoodie, but in a simple, elegant navy blue dress. She looked poised, confident, and much older than her 17 years. She began her speech without addressing the controversy directly. She spoke about her passion for robotics, about the beauty of logic and problem-solving. Then she transitioned. In robotics and in science, we are trained to gather as much data as possible before reaching a conclusion, she said, her voice clear and steady. To make an assumption based on incomplete data is the formula for failure. A rocket will veer off course, a code will crash, a project will fail. The same is true for people. Now she had their full attention. A few months ago, I was on a flight where a woman made an assumption based on incomplete data. She took a snapshot of me, a black teenager in a hoodie, and in her mind, she ran a faulty algorithm. The result of her calculation was that I didn't belong. Her conclusion was based on a single variable, my appearance. She ignored all other data points, my ticket, my confirmation, my very presence. It was a catastrophic failure of logic. She paused, letting the words sink in. Much has been said about what happened next, about the phone call, about the chartering of the plane, and I want to address that. I need to acknowledge a fundamental truth: I am privileged. My father has resources that few people have. The fact that he was able to resolve the situation in such a dramatic fashion is not a story about me being special. It's a story about the power imbalance that exists in our world. What I did making that call is not a solution available to everyone. It was, however, the only solution available to me at that moment to stop an abuse of power. The honesty in her voice was disarming. But this isn't about my father's money. It's about the flight attendant's prejudice, her initial illogical data-deficient judgment. That is the root of the problem. Because that same faulty algorithm runs in the minds of people every single day in situations where there is no powerful father to call. It runs in job interviews, in traffic stops, in classrooms, and in hospital emergency rooms. And in those instances, the consequences are far more devastating than a ruined flight. Eleanor Vance, the flight attendant, is now telling her story. Zara continued, her gaze sweeping across the room. And she has every right to do so. But her story is one of conclusions looking for data to support it. My story is one where the data was ignored in favor of a conclusion that had already been reached. I am not here to ask for your sympathy. I am here to ask you to be better scientists in your own lives, to gather all the data, to see the whole person, not just the snapshot, to challenge your own faulty algorithms. She concluded, "My name is Zara Washington. I am a student, a daughter, and a friend. I am the captain of a robotics team. I am a young black woman who is proud of who she is. And yes, for one day, I was the girl who owned a jet. But I don't want to be defined by that one day. I, like all of you, want to be defined by the full and complete sum of my data." When she finished, there was a moment of profound silence, followed by an eruption of applause. It was a standing ovation that went on for several minutes. Her speech went viral, but this time the conversation wasn't about a jet girl or a Karen. It was about her intelligence, her grace, and the power of her message. In the aftermath, Eleanor Vance's narrative crumbled. Juxtaposed against Zara's thoughtful and dignified speech, her claims of victimhood seemed petty and dishonest. Her 15 minutes of fame were over. The interview backfired, cementing her reputation not as a victim, but as a bitter and unreliable narrator. She faded back into the obscurity from which she came, a cautionary tale about the high cost of a closed mind. Zara, on the other hand, had successfully reclaimed her own story. She had taken a moment of humiliation and transformed it into a platform for a much larger conversation. She had proven that she was not defined by her father's power, but by the strength of her own character and intellect. She went back to her lab, her blueprints, and her equations, but with a new understanding of the world and her place within it. She was still going to build drones, but now she knew that her voice could fly just as high and just as far. So what's the real takeaway from the story of Zara Washington and Eleanor Vance? It's a jaw-dropping tale of karma for sure. But it goes deeper. It's a powerful reminder that the person you underestimate could be the one who holds all the cards. It's about how prejudice, that small, ugly seed in the human heart, can grow into a weed that chokes your entire life if you let it. Zara didn't ask for that confrontation, but when it came, she met it with a quiet strength that was more powerful than any tantrum could ever be. She reminds us that true power isn't about showing off, it's about knowing your worth even when others try to deny it. What did you think of Zara's final decision? Was it justice, or was it too harsh? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. We've all had moments where we wish we could deliver a little karma. Share your own story of seeing someone get exactly what they deserved. And if you enjoyed this story and want more tales of dramatic reversals and justice served, don't forget to hit that like button, share this video with a friend, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us keep telling stories that matter. Thanks for listening.